The air felt thin, sharp, almost brittle, the day I understood what it meant to truly be broken. It wasn't a sudden crash, no dramatic explosion of glass and splintered wood. Instead, it was a slow, insidious erosion, like water wearing away stone, until one morning I woke up and found myself hollowed out, a shell of who I once believed myself to be. That particular morning, the light streaming through my window felt like an accusation, too bright, too unforgiving, highlighting every raw edge of my shattered spirit. I remember the weight of the silence in my apartment, a silence that usually brought me comfort, but then it was a deafening roar, echoing the chaos within my own mind. For so long, I had carried the burden of a betrayal, a wound inflicted by someone I trusted implicitly, someone I had poured so much of my heart and soul into. The kind of trust that feels like a sacred vow, whispered in the quiet intimacy of shared dreams, beneath the silent promise of forever. It was a bond woven so tightly, thread by delicate thread, that to imagine its unraveling was to imagine the very fabric of my being tearing apart. And yet, it did. It didn't just fray at the edges, it was ripped violently from the center, leaving a gaping, ragged hole where warmth and certainty once resided. The morning I spoke of, the one where the light felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, was not the morning of the revelation. No, that had come weeks, perhaps months, before. The revelation had been a sudden, brutal blow, a punch to the gut that left me gasping for air, crumpled on the floor of my own disbelief. It was the moment the world tilted on its axis, and every star I had ever navigated by blinked out of existence. That day was a blur of nausea, and a ringing in my ears that wasn't sound but the reverberation of my own shattered reality. But this particular morning, weeks later, was different. It was the quiet aftermath, the settling of the dust after the explosion. It was the day I truly grasped the extent of the damage, the irreversible nature of the destruction. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a dull, persistent ache that had burrowed deep into my bones. My body felt heavy, yet simultaneously hollow, as if my organs had been replaced by lead and my spirit by an echoing void. I remember staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror that morning, not truly seeing myself, but rather an outline, a faint impression of a person I used to know. My eyes, usually bright with an inquisitive spark, were now flat, vacant pools, reflecting only the harsh glare of the fluorescent light. There was a weariness etched around them, a perpetual shadow that no amount of sleep could banish. My skin, once vibrant, now seemed translucent, stretched taut over bones that felt too fragile to hold me upright. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the unfamiliar angles, the sharp planes that had replaced the soft contours of my former self. It was like looking at a stranger, a ghost haunting the remnants of a life that was no longer mine. The silence in my apartment was a character in itself during those days. Before, it had been a sanctuary, a canvas upon which I painted my thoughts, a quiet companion to my creative endeavors. Now it was a predator, lurking in every corner, its stillness amplifying the frantic, disordered symphony of my own mind. It was the sound of unspoken words, of arguments that never happened, of apologies that were never offered, of futures that evaporated into thin air. It was the echo of laughter that had once filled these rooms, now replaced by an unbearable emptiness. Each creak of the old floorboards, each distant siren, each drip from the faucet in the kitchen, became a piercing intrusion, a reminder of the world continuing its indifferent spin while mine had irrevocably stopped. I tried, in those early weeks, to fight it. I tried to force myself through the motions of a normal life. I would get out of bed, shower, dress, even attempt to eat, but each action felt monumental, a Herculean effort against an invisible current dragging me under. The food tasted like ash, the water like dust, The clothes felt alien on my skin, an uncomfortable costume I was forced to wear. The world outside my window, once a source of endless fascination, now seemed garish and overwhelming, its colors too bright, its sounds too loud, its relentless forward momentum, a cruel mockery of my own paralysis. Friends would call, their voices tinny and distant through the phone. I would offer vague excuses, feign a cold, a sudden workload, anything to avoid the effort of explaining, of pretending, of letting them see the gaping chasm that had opened within me. How could I articulate this feeling of being utterly disintegrated, of having my very essence scooped out and discarded? How could I explain that the person they knew, the one who laughed easily and embraced life with a fierce optimism, was simply gone? It felt like a death, but without the closure, without the rituals of mourning. It was a living death, a constant, gnawing awareness of absence. The betrayal itself was not a single, isolated incident. It was a slow, deliberate chipping away at the foundations of my trust, masked by layers of carefully constructed affection and plausible deniability. It was a masterpiece of deception, executed with such precision that when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just wound me. It made me question my entire perception of reality. If something so fundamental, so deeply felt could be a lie, then what else was? My memories, my judgments, my intuition, all felt tainted, unreliable, corrupted. I began to doubt everything, most painfully, myself. I replayed every conversation, every shared glance, every intimate moment, searching for clues I had missed, for red flags I had ignored. Had I been naive, blind, foolish? The self-recrimination was a relentless tormentor, whispering venomous accusations in the silence of my mind. It wasn't just the pain of being wronged, it was the humiliation of having been so thoroughly deceived, of having invested so much of my vulnerable heart into something so utterly false. It was the crushing weight of knowing that the person I had loved, the person I had trusted with the deepest parts of my soul, was capable of such calculated cruelty. The sacred vow, whispered in the quiet intimacy of shared dreams, beneath the silent promise of forever, felt like a cruel joke now. It had been a shield, a sanctuary, a foundation upon which I had planned to build a lifetime. Now it was just a hollow echo, a broken sound in a deserted chamber. The very act of whispering such a vow, of pouring out one's soul, implies an unspoken agreement of mutual vulnerability, of unwavering respect for the fragility of another's heart. To break that vow was not just a breach of promise. It was an act of desecration, a deliberate shattering of something sacred. I would sit for hours, unmoving, in the armchair by the window, watching the world outside. The trees swayed in the wind, oblivious. People walked by, their faces a blur of purpose and emotion I could no longer access. Children laughed in the park, their joyous shouts a sharp contrast to the dull ache in my chest. I felt utterly disconnected, a ghost observing a vibrant, living tableau from behind a pane of impenetrable glass. The sunlight, once a source of warmth and vitality, now felt like an X-ray, piercing through my skin, exposing the ragged edges of my internal wounds, highlighting the emptiness within. It was merciless in its clarity, refusing to allow me the comfort of shadow or illusion. Sleep offered little respite. My nights were haunted by fragmented dreams, surreal collages of past happiness and present despair. I would wake in a cold sweat, the phantom touch of a hand, the whisper of a familiar voice, lingering just beyond the edge of consciousness, only to dissolve into the harsh reality of my solitary bed. The pillow was often damp with tears I couldn't remember shedding, a testament to the subconscious anguish that continued its work even when my waking mind was too numb to feel. The concept of time lost all meaning. Days bled into nights, weeks into months. I existed in a perpetual twilight, a state of suspended animation. The routine tasks of life, once effortless, became insurmountable mountains. Grocery shopping felt like an expedition to a foreign land. Paying bills was an act of bureaucratic torture. Even deciding what to wear became an overwhelming task, each choice feeling utterly meaningless in the face of such profound internal collapse. I gravitated towards neutral colors, soft fabrics, anything that wouldn't draw attention, anything that felt like a protective shroud. I tried to read, to lose myself in stories, but the words swam before my eyes, refusing to coalesce into meaning. Music, once a constant companion, now felt like an assault. The melodies, once so rich with emotion, now only served to amplify my own sorrow, twisting happy tunes into mournful dirges. I yearned for silence, yet the silence was also my tormentor. It was a paradox, a cruel trap from which there seemed no escape. The process of hollowing out was insidious, as the initial shock gave way to a slow, methodical dismantling of my inner world. It was like a sculptor, instead of adding to a block of stone, was meticulously chipping away at a statue already formed, removing piece by piece until only a fragile, empty shell remained. My passions, my interests, my aspirations, they all seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a barren landscape. I couldn't remember what truly excited me, what ignited a spark of joy. The vibrant tapestry of my inner life had been reduced to a single, monochromatic thread of grief. I missed the person I used to be with a fierce, aching longing. I missed her laughter, her boundless energy, her quick wit, her unwavering belief in the good of others. I missed her capacity for joy, her ability to find beauty in the mundane, her fearless embrace of vulnerability. She felt like a beloved friend who had died, and I was left to mourn her, knowing that her demise was inextricably linked to my own suffering. Sometimes, I would catch a fleeting glimpse of her in an old photograph, her eyes sparkling with unburdened happiness, and a fresh wave of despair would wash over me, a bitter reminder of what had been irrevocably lost. The weight of the betrayal was not just emotional, it felt physical. A constant pressure behind my eyes, a tightness in my chest, a knot in my stomach that no amount of deep breathing could loosen. My posture slumped, my movements became sluggish. It was as if my body itself was trying to reflect the internal collapse, to manifest the invisible wounds in tangible ways. I often felt a profound exhaustion, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer effort of existing, of carrying the immense burden of my broken spirit. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when a flicker of anger would ignite within me. A sharp, hot burst of righteous indignation at the injustice, at the sheer callousness of it all. But it would quickly dissipate, extinguished by the overwhelming tide of sadness and self-doubt. Anger required energy, a belief in one's own worthiness to be wronged, and I had very little of either left. Instead, a pervasive sense of resignation settled over me, a quiet acceptance of my fate, a dull understanding that this was simply my new reality. The concept of moving on felt like a cruel joke. How does one move on when the very ground beneath one's feet has crumbled? How does one rebuild when the blueprints for their future have been shredded? It felt impossible, a task too monumental for a person who could barely summon the will to breathe. The idea of trusting again, of opening my heart to another, was terrifying. The memory of the betrayal was a searing brand, a constant reminder of the catastrophic consequences of vulnerability. It had taught me a brutal lesson. To love deeply was to risk annihilation. I spent countless hours staring blankly at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the plaster, each imperfection becoming a metaphor for the fissures in my own soul. I thought about the words that had been spoken, the promises that had been made, the dreams that had been shared. Each memory was a shard of glass, cutting deeper with every recollection. There was no escape, no mental sanctuary where the pain could not reach me. My own mind had become a prison, and I was both the prisoner and the tormentor. The world outside continued its relentless march, indifferent to my internal cataclysm. Seasons changed, holidays came and went, but I remained suspended in my personal purgatory. The vibrancy of spring, the warmth of summer, the crispness of autumn, the quiet hush of winter. They all passed me by, their beauty dulled, their significance lost. I was merely an observer, a shadow flitting through the edges of life, unable to participate, unable to feel the pulse of the world around me. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, a desperate plea would form on my lips, a silent cry for release, for an end to the ceaseless ache. But even that was a fleeting thought, quickly swallowed by the crushing weight of apathy. I wasn't suicidal, not in the active sense, but I felt a profound weariness, a longing for oblivion, for the quiet peace of non-existence. It wasn't a desire to die, but a desperate wish to simply stop hurting, to cease being. The idea of healing felt like a mythical concept, something spoken of in distant lands, but utterly unattainable in my present reality. How could something that had been so thoroughly shattered ever be pieced back together? The cracks would always remain, the glue would always be visible, a constant reminder of the breakage. And even if it could be mended, would it ever be the same? Would the light ever shine through it in the same way? Would it ever hold the same strength, the same integrity? I doubted it. I truly doubted it. The morning light, which had felt like an accusation, continued its daily assault. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the subtle signs of neglect in my apartment, the faint lines of worry etched deeper into my face. It was relentless, refusing to allow me the comfort of dimness, of hiding in the shadows. It forced me to confront the stark reality of my existence, stripped bare of all illusions, and in that confrontation, in that raw, unvarnished exposure, lay the first faint glimmer of something else. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of a different kind of understanding. An understanding that even in the deepest hollow, even in the most profound emptiness, there was still something left to observe, something left to feel, even if that feeling was only the agonizing truth of my own brokenness. It was a painful, brutal awareness, but it was awareness nonetheless. And for the first time in a long time, that awareness felt less like a death sentence and more like a reluctant, agonizing birth, the birth of a new, fractured self, forced to learn how to exist in the ruins of the old. This was not recovery, not by any stretch of the imagination. It was merely the slow, arduous process of learning to breathe again, one ragged, painful gasp at a time, in the echoing silence of my own shattered world. The journey was long, perhaps endless, but for the first time I felt a flicker of something beyond just the burden, a nascent, terrifying curiosity about what shape the fragments might eventually take, if any. The nascent, terrifying curiosity was not a beacon, not a guiding star, but a microscopic tremor in the bedrock of my despair. It was the faintest ripple on a vast, stagnant ocean, barely perceptible but undeniably there. This was not hope. For hope implies a destination, a desired outcome, and I had long since abandoned such luxuries. This was something colder, more analytical, a detached observation of the ongoing catastrophe that was my existence. What shape might the fragments take? The question echoed, not with eagerness, but with a morbid fascination, like a scientist meticulously cataloging the decay of a once vibrant specimen. I began to notice things again, not with the full, vivid spectrum of pre-catastrophe perception, but as if through a veil woven from grief and exhaustion. The quality of the light, for instance. It was no longer just day or night, but a nuanced tapestry of grays and muted blues. The way the dust motes danced in the sparse beams that pierced the drawn blinds became a subject of quiet, almost involuntary study. Each tiny particle, suspended in its brief, illuminated journey, seemed to mirror my own suspended animation, a transient flicker in a vast, indifferent space. My eyes, once blind with tears, now saw patterns in the peeling paint on the distant wall, textures in the worn fabric of the armchair, the subtle shifts in the shadows as the hours bled into one another. These were not beautiful observations. They were simply observations, data points for this new, fractured consciousness. My body, a vessel of forgotten desires and remembered pain, continued its automatic processes. Hunger would gnaw, a dull ache in my gut, pulling me reluctantly towards the kitchen. The act of preparing even the simplest meal, a piece of toast, a glass of water, was a monumental undertaking, each movement deliberate, heavy, as if I were wading through treacle. The taste of food was largely absent, a ghost of its former self, yet the sensation of chewing, of swallowing, was a tangible anchor, a reminder that this physical form, however broken, still persisted. It was a bizarre dichotomy, my mind a maelstrom of shattered thoughts, my body a lumbering automaton, performing the bare minimum required for continued existence. Sleep offered little respite, often a descent into a murky realm of half-forgotten dreams and restless tossing, only to wake with the same crushing weight, the same profound emptiness. Yet even in this, there was a faint recognition of the cycle, a primitive understanding of the body's insistence on survival, a silent, stubborn will that defied the mind's desire for oblivion. Memories, once a relentless torrent of torment, began to shift. They were still there, always there, like jagged shards embedded deep within my being, but occasionally, in moments of extreme quiet, I found myself observing them, not as the immediate, searing agony they once were, but as artifacts. Distant echoes of a life that felt impossibly far away, belonging to someone else entirely. It was a strange, disquieting sensation, akin to examining a fossil, a perfect imprint of what once lived, but utterly devoid of its warmth, its breath, its vibrant terror. The jagged shards remained, certainly, but sometimes, just sometimes, their edges seemed dulled by an invisible patina of time, or perhaps by the sheer, unyielding pressure of my own sustained numbness. This was not healing, not in any conventional sense. It was more like a scar forming, a thickening of the emotional skin around the wound, rather than the wound itself closing. The pain was still there, a constant thrum beneath the surface, but it had begun to lose its power to completely incapacitate me, to plunge me into the abyss with every recollection. Instead, I could sometimes hold